This is a CBS News special report. From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Dan Rather.
Good evening. It is now well into Sunday morning in Beijing. In the aftermath of last night's violence, one hospital doctor is now estimating that at least 500 people died in the bloodbath. He said, and I quote, "My government has gone insane."
Some reports say more than
emphasized that no one has confirmed that they are.
Tiananmen, literally the gate of heavenly peace. Today, it stands as a site of national unity and government power in the heart of Beijing's metro area. But it wasn't always like this. June 4th, 1989, 30 years and 10 days ago. Tiananmen Square is a sea of violence, with the People's Liberation Army shooting at fleeing protesters, a violent end to a months-long peaceful protest. April 1989, 2 months before the massacre. The square is full of students boycotting classes to mourn the death of Hu Yaobang, a leftist government leader. Hu had been forced to resign as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China and died several days prior. The students suspected government-backed assassination. The students, tired of rampant government corruption, inflation, and rising unemployment, believed Hu's policies could turn the country around. Soon, the students began echoing Hu's ideas and clarified their demands: greater government transparency, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, economic equality, and increased educational funding. Chinese leadership adopted a hardline stance against these protests, condemning them as a chaotic, retrograde revolt. However, this stance only exacerbated public anger, leading to larger and more passionate protests. The students enjoyed popular support, and soon the movement snowballed as more people included their own grievances in the protest, demanding action against rampant inflation, income disparity, government corruption, profiteering, nepotism, and more. The government became paralyzed as a split within the CCP emerged between Zhao Ziyang, the General Secretary, and Li Peng, the Premier, both vying for Deng Xiaoping's position as paramount leader. Li advocated for the use of force against the protests, but his aggressive stance failed to disperse the movement. Zhao, however, introduced a more conciliatory approach and managed to defuse some tension through sympathetic speeches. By now, there was a clear division between those who condemned and those who supported the protest within the government. Students, seeking new ways to pressure the CCP, set their eyes on the looming Sino-Soviet summit, which was to be held adjacent to Tiananmen Square. They redoubled their efforts to occupy the square and disrupt the critical meeting by starting hunger strikes. Frantic, the government searched for ways to end the protest before Gorbachev and an army of international journalists arrived in Beijing. Secretary Zhao continued his sympathetic approach, often visiting hospitalized hunger strikers and giving speeches in the square. However, Deng Xiaoping feared that Zhao was sacrificing too much government power to pacify the students, and dismissed him. After Zhao was dismissed, Li Peng declared martial law. But even as the People's Liberation Army rolled into Beijing to quell the protests, students remained non-violent. Students band together with ordinary citizens and a newly formed workers' union to block the advancement of the army with their own bodies. Masses of people then began talking with the soldiers, speaking as if they were old friends and dulling the soldiers' hostility. They used words, not weapons. When military vehicles, caught in the sea of bodies, ran dangerously low on supplies, protesters began distributing instant noodles, water, and fruit to starving soldiers. Moved by their kindness and dedication to peaceful change, many army veterans began to side with the students. Their peaceful protests influenced not only the soldiers, but many politicians as well. Hundreds of party cadres wrote to CCP leadership, urging them not to resort to force. Beijing's legislators began planning to veto martial law. Government workers joined in on the protests too. The movement appeared to be on the cusp of triumph. On the night of June 4th, 1989, the People's Liberation Army rolled into Tiananmen Square and forcibly, violently, permanently ended the peaceful protests. A day later, after a night of confusion, chaos, and violence, one man walked out onto Chang'an Boulevard with 2 bags of groceries in hand. He stared down a line of tanks, halting their advance. This one, final moment of rebellion, became a symbol of civil disobedience and a catalyst for future peaceful protests. But not in China. In China, this video was immediately used to refute claims of soldier brutality. Chinese leaders said that it proved the military exercised utmost restraint while dispersing the protesters. The violent, tragic end to the peaceful protests outraged nations around the world and, in the short term, contributed to the fall of authoritarianism internationally. However, the protests ultimately failed to introduce long-lasting democratic reform in China. The government, however, won a definitive victory. The CCP expanded its power by crushing opposition, translating into a triumph for the Chinese government. Finally, the citizens were deprived of key human rights and forced to live under an insulated, omnipotent government, but saw their quality of life improve dramatically. Most citizens now wholeheartedly support the highly capable, if authoritarian, government. The heartless killing of young, peaceful student protesters was a tragedy for human rights. However, this tragedy seemed to lead to the triumph of the protesters' ideology. This unknown protester, dubbed as Tank Man by the West, became a symbol for peaceful protest and remains potent. This image is still banned in China today, and most of China's younger generation does not even recognize it. The civil disobedience Tank Man represented resounded across the world. Over 4,500 miles away, citizens in East Germany held a special memorial service in the victim's honor. The Tiananmen protest re-galvanized the East German citizens' Leipzig protests, which demanded increased democracy and freedom of travel. Also inspired by the Tiananmen protests, the Mongolian Democratic Union started a hunger strike in St. Square. The Mongolians' commitment to nonviolence, just like the Beijing students, allowed for a peaceful revolution leading to mass communist resignation and free elections. However, Tiananmen's influence waned as the years eroded the students' martyrdom. Recognizing the potency of the students' rebellion, Chinese leadership seeks to debase the protesters' ideology to ensure that Tiananmen Square protests never happen again. China's first step was erasing the Tiananmen Square massacre from history. June 1989 is a void in Chinese history classes, and almost all discussion online of the protest is censored.
Today is a special day, but if you can take a look of how the Chinese internet it's dead. I'm sorry, yeah. But I have a lot of friends. Most of them, 99% of them, don't know what's going on or don't know what happened.
Tiananmen's prevalence in international media steadily declined after 1989 and as China distracted the world with the 2008 Olympics. When the U.S. housing market crashed in 2009, China became one of the U.S.'s largest creditors. Since then, politicians have deprioritized fighting for human rights in China. However, the spirit of the protest lives on in Hong Kong.
This year's protest marks the 30th anniversary of the June 4 incident. Protesters, were showing a lot of emotions when they were mourning for the loved ones. But other people were also there to express their concerns for the extradition bill. The people protesting for the extradition bill, they wanted a country that promoted democracy, where students can vote about a particular issue.
However, things are different in mainland China.
The few citizens aware of the event agree that while the violence was unfortunate, they preferred this current version of history. Ignoring the influence of propaganda, the decades of explosive growth China has thus seen has convinced many Chinese people that any fundamental change to the government would result in less effective leadership, and therefore slower development. Even some who once participated in the protest now support the current government.
问了，就是说你认为这个事件这个结果，是最好的结果吗？当然是，因为那之后中国在比较平稳和安全的状况下发展经济，发展了30年。中国现在多好。
In the end, the Tiananmen Square massacre became a triumph for the Chinese government. A purge following the event removed many liberal leaders, ensuring political stability for the Communist Party. The Tiananmen Square massacre, while often seen as a disaster through Western lens, was actually more beneficial to some groups than one might expect. Is the massacre just another entry on China's long list of tragic human rights abuses? Or is it the launch pad from which a capable government began lifting millions out of poverty? The truth depends on who you ask.